Today, we discuss the importance of a sacred place. This discussion, however, is going to be a difficult one for us because I will ask you to look at how we have come to see a building and a land and rethink the whole idea of God's presence in the world. It will make us look at very briefly and inadequately of our history and values we hold dear without deep reflections. As always, God's way challenges our ways deeply and unsettles us in ways we have never thought about. We do all these upsetting of our comfortable thoughts as Jesus upset the tables of money changers and merchants in the temple. Our goal, however, is not to upset and leave everything in shambles. Rather, our goal is to see from the perspective that is close to Christ's and celebrate God's presence manifested through sacred places in our world. Keep this goal in mind when something makes you feel very uncomfortable. Where is the church called Kirk on the Hill? Many people will know it as the church across from A.K. Wick Public School on Heist Street. It is an unassuming building that can easily be passed by if someone is not paying attention. Those of us who gather here see it as our hub of spiritual activity. It is where we come to worship, study the Bible, and enjoy fellowship of Christians. For locals, it is a place they come to cast votes or hold meetings, to attend weddings or funerals. We do our best to keep the building nice and inviting. In today's passage, Abram is told to move away from his home into the new and strange world. It is not as if Abram we meet is already a world traveler who knows what awaits him in these new places. Abram is to leave his home just because into the unknown world. So he does with his family. If Abram is alive today, he probably gets to travel differently by checking the weather reports, Google Maps, acquiring proper international visas, making sure to have enough money and working phones, credit cards, and hotel reservations. Abram of Genesis, on the other hand, uproots his family and gets on the road. No maps, no phones, no credit cards, and no visas to enter different countries. He has no idea what he will face in weather, local conditions, and dangers. He enters Canaan. He passes the Oak of Moreh. There God speaks to him. He moves farther into Canaan, east of Bethel. There he builds an altar and invokes God's name. Then he moves on towards the Negev and as far as Egypt. Originally, Bethel was called Luz. It was renamed as Bethel by Jacob. Abram went just beyond Bethel. Before Jacob named the place Bethel, God appeared to Jacob's grandfather in this part of the world. Abram built an altar there. This altar was the sign of God's presence in a strange land for Abram, who left his home country only on God's command. To Abram, God's appearance to give him promise was something to commemorate. He was in a strange land, yet this strange place was where his God was already present. With the assurance of God's presence, he could go anywhere. This God was not staying put in one locality like other gods of the time. This God was already present in these strange places Abram and his family were venturing into. Isaac also meets God. In Genesis 26, we read that Isaac went to Beersheba, and that night God came to him. The result of this encounter is a building of an altar by Isaac. Bethel comes back to us as an important place in Abram's grandson Jacob's life. Jacob is not particularly religious, devout, or moral. He is just a regular fellow who is trying to find his way in the world. He does not have his brother Esau's physical ability to be a good hunter, nor does he appear as a strong, manly type. He is described as having a smooth skin and has the love of his mother. As a mother's boy, it is his mother who looks after his well-being as well as his future. He has to depend on his mother because he is weak. Jacob, as the mother's boy, cheats his brother out of blessings and in fear runs away according to his mother's instructions. On the way, he falls asleep at Luz. There in the wilderness, God appears to him in a dream. He wakes up and says, "Surely the Lord is in this place. I did not know it." Next morning, he uses the stone he co-opted as his pillow to build a pillar and consecrated it by pouring oil on the top of it, naming the place Bethel. Later, long after returning and reconciling with his brother Esau, Jacob was told to go back to Bethel by God to live there. The common thread for the 3 generations of Abram, who later was renamed as Abraham, is that God appears to each of them in a specific place. Each one comes to encounter God, and they mark those places with altars or pillars. These symbols are the living witnesses of God's presence in the world. There is a great parallel of this ritual in our indigenous people's ways of marking sacred places. Later, as the 12 tribes of Israel were led to wander in the desert, they traveled with the ark, which became the symbol of God's presence among them. Eventually, the ark was placed in the temple at Jerusalem to signify God's presence with the kingdom of Israel ruled by Solomon. We see similar desires with Jesus' disciples. When Peter, James, and John witnessed Jesus' transfiguration and the presence of Moses and Elijah, they wanted to build dwellings for these heavenly beings. It appears that this tradition of representing God's presence in the world by building something is inherent in all human beings. We see similar stories of encounter with their gods in many early peoples all over the world. The sacred places were marked and kept holy everywhere. Indeed, our indigenous brothers and sisters have been fighting against us at Ipawash and Caledonia because we have not respected their sacred grounds. Jews have Jerusalem, Muslims have Mecca, Roman Catholics have Rome. As Protestants, however, we have very utilitarian views of our church buildings. Apart from our own sense of historicity, importance of historic significance, we see it primarily as a place of gathering for worship and being the center of our spiritual life. Beyond these functions, we see not much else. After all, we have been singing, "The church is not a building, the church is not a steeple, the church is not a resting place, the church is a people." In the past 50 years, there has been a move to build churches as useful and multipurpose spaces. Many new and growing church buildings are more like an auditorium or a theater. Most megachurches hardly look like the churches of the past, looking more like megabox stores with vast parking lots. It is quite easy to think about redeveloping church properties as needs and functions change. Again, we sing, "I am the church, you are the church, we are the church together." Why bother with a place that is transitory? From very early on, when Christians were building the church buildings and lands on which they were built were consecrated or set apart for the sacred use of worshiping and being the visible symbol of God's presence in the world. This practice often took a superstitious tone as people began insisting only the Christians who were not considered sinners were to be buried on the church properties. Soon, a new practice of decommissioning arose for those properties when church buildings and lands were no longer used for the purpose they were intended, and people moved on, either closing the churches or selling the properties. Nowadays, in many cases, we do not even decommission. We simply sell off churches and lands along with all the contents within them. Again, stressing on the fact that the church is the people. Physical buildings and properties are not the church of Jesus Christ. One trouble with this way of utilitarian thinking is that we end up devaluing anything physical and material. Sacred or spiritual realms are separated out from physical and concrete. It drives us into materialism. In this way of thinking, everything physical is commodified and is at our disposal. We can use these material things any way we like. As mentioned, church buildings and properties are nothing more than buildings for our use and can be bought and sold. They are useful so far as we are able to extract some use out of them. The trouble is, in our effort to extract maximum value from them, we end up forgetting what these church buildings and properties signify in the world. Added to this, we face another difficulty in our technological age. The current trend is to test the sacredness of God's appearance with methods of scientific inquiry. We are told to test all our experiences, especially the sacred spiritual experiences, using scientifically verifiable methods and means. In this scientific world, the one-off experiences that cannot be replicated or verified are dismissed as untrue or not accepted as true. The result of this scientific inquiry often diminishes the importance of this spiritual experience, making it subject to the current-day materialism, meaning only those things that meet our scientific tests are verified as true or valuable. In this atmosphere, it is impossible for us to witness God's presence in the world, sharing our experiences of God's appearance and promises. We have been hearing a lot about healing and reconciliation, disputes at Ipawash that have not yet been resolved, land claims in Caledonia by our indigenous brothers and sisters. In our utilitarian thinking about lands and places, our demands to others to accept scientific methods make us deaf to the cries of our indigenous brothers and sisters regarding the sacred lands they want to protect. To us, their claims make no sense. It is only a burial ground, we say. We would not fight over our graves after the grave sites are sold or overtaken. We want them to do the same. After all, these indigenous brothers and sisters do not have the titles with their names saying that these lands belong to them. Look how the court sides with non-indigenous folks and land developers. Isn't this proof enough? It should be noted that Abram, Isaac, and Jacob were not attached to those sacred places, yet these places in their travels through foreign or strange lands were reminders that they encountered their God away from home. They marked those places not to worship the places and altars they built, but as recognition that God was present in those unknown parts of the world. Those markers called them to worship as these physical things became reminders of God's presence, blessings, and promises for those who were under God's care. These experiences were crucial in being faithful to their God. If these sacred places cannot be marked and celebrated, where can we find God of the past who brought us into the present? How can we be assured of the blessings of God and the promise of God given to our ancestors, which make us who we are today? The Kirk on the hill is an unassuming, humble building. Unlike the United Church building that draws the eyes of those who drive by, the Baptist Church on Pelham Street, we are tucked away on a side easily missed. The traffic lights demand more attention than the church building itself. We know where it is because it is our spiritual home. We know that this building signifies God's presence for us. The trouble is, we are one of those hidden secrets of God's presence for most people who pass by. Sure, we have a sign. The sign says the building will come alive with people once a week on Sunday morning when we are free of pandemic lockdowns. We know that with coming together on Sunday mornings for an hour or two, the church will be full of joy and celebration. It is not clear how many of those who are passing by get encouraged that God is present in the world by seeing our building. The question is, who else should know about our experiences of God? Should we make our experiences of God known to those around us in Fonthill at all? Should we simply keep our encounters with God here in our hearts and ponder? As we think about this, one question we need to keep in the back of our minds is, what promise did God give to those who experienced God's appearance here for us to have built this church? Did God give us the same blessing that God gave to Abram and Jacob, the blessing of numerous descendants who will occupy Canaan, in our case, Font Hill? When we were pondering to be a church, how did God appear to those who were organizing? Can we learn from our indigenous brothers and sisters on how to keep our building and the land sacred so that our experience of God can be the life-giving force? We do not have to worship the building and the land, but can we celebrate the experience, setting this building and the land apart for holy use, because we remember that God spoke, speaks, and will speak to us here?